My name is Clara Bennett, and I'm 37 years old. If you had looked around that engagement dinner last Saturday night, you would have seen exactly what my mother wanted everyone else to see. My younger brother Ethan stood beneath warm hanging lights in a tailored navy suit, one hand resting on his fiancée Sloane's back, smiling like a man whose life had unfolded exactly the way it was supposed to. My mother, Vanessa Bennett, stood near the center of the room with a champagne flute in one hand and a room full of well-dressed guests hanging on every word. And me? I was seated near the far end of the table in a black dress no one complimented, listening to my mother tilt her head and say, in that soft, polished voice she used when she wanted cruelty to sound like concern, "Clara has always had such a big heart. Stability just never seemed to find her." A few people gave me sympathetic smiles. One woman lowered her eyes like she was embarrassed for me. My brother stared into his glass. Nobody said a word in my defense. That was how it had always been in my family. I was never the daughter they introduced with pride. I was the one they explained. But my story didn't start in that beautiful warehouse on the Savannah riverfront. It started 8 years earlier, in September of 2018, when I was 29 and living in Chicago, halfway through a master's program in architecture that I had fought hard to get into. I was tired all the time, living on coffee and deadlines, but I loved that life more than I had loved anything I could remember. I loved the smell of foam board and tracing paper. I loved staying late in the studio when the rest of campus had gone quiet. I loved the idea that one day I might design buildings that made people feel safe, not just impressed. That mattered to me, maybe because I had never felt especially safe in my own family. In our house growing up, achievement was currency, appearances were everything, and love often felt like it had to be earned in public. Ethan was good at that world. He was polished, easy to celebrate, easy to present. I was quieter. I thought more than I spoke. I cared less about looking impressive than being useful. My mother had never quite forgiven me for that. The call came just after midnight. I was still in studio, bent over a scale model, when my phone buzzed across the table. I almost ignored it because I was behind on a review packet, but something made me pick it up. The number was from Georgia. A nurse at Southeast Georgia Health told me my grandfather Walter had fallen while boarding up his property ahead of a storm. Broken hip, cracked ribs, surgery already scheduled for dawn. She said I was listed as his emergency contact, and I remember that detail more clearly than anything else she said after. Not my mother, not Ethan, me. Even then, part of me wasn't surprised. My grandfather had always seen people clearly, and he had known for years which members of our family would actually show up when things got difficult. I called my mother the second I hung up. She answered with irritation already in her voice, like my emergency had interrupted something more important. When I told her what happened, there was silence on the line, but not the kind that comes from fear. It was the kind that comes from inconvenience. Then she said she had a fundraising event the next evening, and Ethan had investor meetings with Sloane's family. "Can you go?" she asked, as if I lived across the street instead of 1,000 miles away. I waited for her to say she was coming too. She didn't. Ethan texted me a few minutes later, saying he couldn't make it because Sloane's relatives were in town. "Keep me posted," he wrote. That was his entire contribution to a family emergency. I threw clothes into a duffel bag, emailed my professor from the airport, and took the first flight I could find to Georgia the next morning. I still remember the sky when I landed in Jacksonville and drove north toward Brunswick. Gray, low, swollen with leftover storm clouds. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my palms hurt. At the hospital, my grandfather looked like someone had tried to fold him into a shape he wasn't meant to hold. He had tubes in his arm, bruises darkening beneath his skin, and rage simmering beneath the medication. He hated being helpless. When he saw me, his face softened for half a second, then hardened again. He gripped my wrist and said, "Don't let your mother turn this into theater." At the time, I thought he was warning me not to let her dramatize his injury for sympathy. What I didn't understand yet was that he meant something much bigger. He meant the story. He meant that in my family, facts were never enough. Whoever framed them first usually won. The doctors were blunt. Surgery would be followed by a long recovery. Rehab, medication, mobility assistance, monitoring. He couldn't go home alone. Insurance would only cover so much, and the rest was more than he could afford. My mother came to the hospital late that evening in heels that clicked too sharply against the floor, kissed Grandpa on the forehead, asked two superficial questions, and then pulled me aside near the vending machines. "You'll need to stay a while," she said. Not can you. Not will you. Just the assumption that, of course, I would be the one rearranging my life. When I reminded her I was in graduate school, she gave me a look I had seen since childhood, that expression that made me feel selfish for even naming my own future. "This is family," she said. "There are more important things than your plans." I wanted to ask why those important things never seemed important enough to interfere with Ethan's plans. I wanted to ask why my life was always the most disposable one in the room. But my grandfather was down the hall, injured and depending on me, so I swallowed it. I went back to Chicago for 3 days to pack up my apartment and meet with my advisor. That was one of the hardest conversations of my life. My professor tried to convince me to take a leave instead of withdrawing completely, but even then, I knew what no one wanted to say out loud. My savings were thin. My grandfather needed full-time help. My family would not step in for me later. If I left, I was probably not coming back. The morning I signed the paperwork, I sat outside the administration building for almost an hour with the withdrawal form folded in my lap. Students kept passing by with portfolios and coffee cups, arguing about projects and deadlines, moving forward like normal life was still available to me if I just stood up fast enough. But I didn't stand up. I signed my name, turned in the form, packed my things, and drove south. By Thanksgiving that same year, my mother had already rewritten the whole story. She told people I had burned out in Chicago. She said the pressure had been too much for me. She implied I was fragile, unstable, not quite built for the life I had wanted. And because she said it in that gentle, regretful tone, everyone believed her. Nobody saw the reality. Nobody saw me crushing pills into applesauce, helping my grandfather in and out of bed, arguing with insurers, cleaning bandages, balancing bills, and trying not to grieve the future I had quietly laid down. That was the first season of my disappearance. In public, I became the daughter people pitied. In private, I became the one holding everything up. And that was where the real story began. When I moved back to Brunswick, I told myself it was temporary. That was the lie I used to get through the first few weeks. Temporary sounded survivable. Temporary sounded like I was still the woman who would return to Chicago, re-enter the studio, and pick up the life I had set down without anyone noticing it had been interrupted. But real life doesn't pause neatly like that. It keeps moving, and if you're not careful, it hardens around the version of you that people find most convenient. My grandfather came home from rehab in October, still angry, still stubborn, still in pain, and the house changed overnight. The living room became a recovery room. There were pill organizers on the end table, grab bars in the bathroom, paperwork stacked across the kitchen counter, and a folding shower chair I hated looking at because it made everything feel permanent. I cooked, cleaned, drove him to physical therapy, called the insurance company so often I knew the hold music by memory, and learned how exhausting it is to keep another person's dignity intact when they hate needing help. My mother visited exactly twice that month, both times dressed beautifully, both times staying less than 40 minutes. She would come in with a worried expression, ask my grandfather how he was feeling in a voice so polished it could have been rehearsed, then pull me aside to remind me not to let myself go, just because life had become difficult. Even then, even watching me hold together a life that wasn't supposed to be mine, she was more concerned with whether I looked like a disappointment than with what it was costing me to keep going. What saved me in those months, or maybe what kept me from disappearing completely, was work no one else could see. After my grandfather fell asleep each night in his recliner, I would sit at the kitchen table with my laptop and sketch. At first, it was almost instinctive. I wasn't trying to start a business. I was trying not to forget who I had been before everything changed. I drew raised foundations, reinforced joints, storm-resistant wall systems, Compact floor plans that could fit on narrow coastal lots without turning into the flimsy, overpriced boxes that kept getting destroyed every hurricane season. Living in Brunswick again forced me to see things I had grown up ignoring. Entire neighborhoods were one bad storm away from collapse, and the people who lived there were always the ones expected to rebuild with the least money and the least help. That stayed with me. I started asking a question I couldn't stop asking. What if safer housing didn't have to be the expensive option? What if resilience could be practical? What if ordinary working families got homes designed to survive instead of homes designed to fail beautifully? Those questions lit something back up inside me. During the day, I was a caretaker. At night, when the house was quiet and the dishes were done and the next day's medication was lined up on the counter, I was still an architect in my own mind, even if the degree was gone, and no one in my family would ever use that word for me again. A local contractor named Ben Weller saw some of my drawings by accident. He had come by to look at a leak near the back porch, noticed the plans spread across the table, and asked who had drawn them. When I said I had, he studied them longer than I expected, then pointed to one elevated cottage design and said, "This actually makes sense." That sentence meant more to me than it probably should have. He asked if I'd ever considered doing freelance drafting, and I nearly laughed because I had been trying so hard not to think of myself as someone with professional skills anymore. But a week later, he called and asked if I could clean up permit drawings for a small flood-prone property near Darien. It wasn't glamorous. It paid almost nothing. But it was the first piece of work that belonged to me since I had left Chicago. And when he handed me a check, I sat in my car afterward and cried harder than I had the day I withdrew from graduate school. Not because of the money, because for the first time in months, I had done something that wasn't just survival. I had made something useful. That tiny project led to another, and then another. A builder in St. Mary's needed help adapting plans for a narrow lot. A church committee wanted ideas for temporary housing after seasonal flooding. A nonprofit coordinator asked whether I could redesign a duplex concept so older residents could age in place without having to leave the community they'd lived in for decades. I said yes to everything. I worked during nap hours, between pharmacy runs, after midnight, before sunrise, whenever I could steal time from the life everyone else assumed had become my only purpose. I didn't tell my mother about any of it, not because I was trying to be secretive, but because I had already learned that the moment she saw me reaching for something of my own, she would find a way to frame it as selfishness, instability, or delusion. So I kept quiet, and because I kept quiet, she filled in the silence with her own version. At family gatherings, she told people I was helping out Walter for a while and trying little projects here and there. She said it the way people describe a child making bracelets out of beads, not a grown woman clawing her way back toward a career, one unpaid hour at a time. Then came the job that almost changed everything. A regional development firm in Savannah called Vega Development had been referred to me by someone Ben knew. They were doing mixed-use housing along the coast and wanted someone who understood resilient design, permitting issues, and real-life constraints instead of just pretty renderings for investors. I met with the owner, Marisol Vega, in a glass-walled office downtown and walked out of that meeting feeling awake in a way I hadn't felt for years. She respected my work. She asked smart questions. She didn't look at my resume gap like it was a stain I needed to apologize for. She looked at my drawings, listened to the reasoning behind them, and said, "You design like someone who understands consequences." I got the offer 2 days later. I still remember staring at the email on my phone in my grandfather's driveway, my hands shaking so hard I had to sit down before I could read it twice. It wasn't a perfect job, but it was real. It was a way back in. For the first time since leaving school, I allowed myself to imagine a future that belonged to me again. And then my mother destroyed it. 3 days before I was supposed to start, Marisol called and said the firm was moving in another direction. Her voice had that careful tone people use when they know something ugly has happened but don't want to be pulled into it. I pressed until she admitted that a family member had reached out more than once to question my reliability and emotional stability. I knew before she finished the sentence. I knew the same way you know a smell from childhood or a door closing in your own house. I drove straight to Savannah and confronted my mother in her front hall while she arranged flowers like she was decorating for a magazine shoot. She didn't deny it. She didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. She told me she had protected the company from making a mistake. She told me I wasn't ready. She told me some opportunities are too big for people who haven't gotten themselves together. I stood there staring at her, realizing in a single brutal moment that my biggest obstacle had never been lack of money or lost schooling or bad luck. It was that the person who should have wanted me to rise had quietly built her identity around keeping me small. That was the night something in me stopped waiting for permission. I went home shattered, yes, but I also went home changed. Because once someone shows you they would rather sabotage your future than lose control of your story, you stop trying to win them over. You start building where they can't reach. After my mother sabotaged that job, I stopped trying to explain myself to anyone in the family. That was the last season of my life where I still believed truth by itself would save me. It wouldn't. Truth needed timing. Truth needed proof. Truth needed walls around it, because in my family, anything unprotected could be reshaped into whatever made my mother look the most noble and me the most disappointing. So I got quiet. Not the broken kind of quiet she liked to assign to me, but a deliberate one. A working quiet. I took every freelance project I could get my hands on, and when those jobs started stacking into something more real, I used my grandfather's last name and filed the paperwork under Clara Hayes. Not because I was ashamed of who I was. I was protecting what I was building from people who had already proven they would rather damage my future than lose control of the story. That little company, Tidemark Habitat, started in a bait shed behind Grandpa Walter's house with 2 secondhand monitors, a folding table, and drawings spread so wide across the walls you could barely see the wood paneling underneath. During the day, I still handled his appointments, his medication, his physical therapy schedule, his meals. At night, I designed flood-resistant cottages, elevated duplexes, emergency modular units, and storm-hardened family homes for towns that never seemed important enough for anyone to invest in until after everything was destroyed. I was tired all the time, but for the first time in years, I was tired for myself. The first 2 years were not glamorous. People always love the success part of a story, but nobody claps for the middle, for the stretch where you eat standing up in the kitchen because you're too busy to sit, where invoices come in faster than payments, where one bad month could crush everything you're trying to build. I lived in the math of survival: lumber costs, permitting delays, fuel prices, zoning meetings, grant deadlines, insurance language, contractor calls. There were nights I fell asleep with my laptop open and woke up to keyboard marks on my cheek. There were mornings I thought I was out of my mind for believing a woman with a half-finished graduate education, no family backing, and a mother actively undermining her reputation could build anything that lasted. But then one project would lead to another. A church in Camden County recommended me to a nonprofit. A contractor in Darien told a county planner I was the only designer he knew who actually understood how poor families lived after storms, instead of how brochures pretended they lived. A cluster of temporary homes we designed after a bad flood performed so well that neighboring officials came to see them in person. Slowly, then all at once, Tidemark stopped feeling like a side effort and started feeling like a company. We hired our first employee, then our third, then our sixth. By the time 4 years had passed, we had municipal contracts, private backers I had chosen carefully, and more demand than I could answer on my own. Every single thing my mother said I lacked, discipline, resilience, stability, direction, had become the exact muscles I had built in silence. And still, every holiday, every family function, every wedding shower and Easter lunch and birthday dinner, the same ritual played out. My mother would shine. Ethan would be introduced with pride. I would be introduced with pity. By then, he was fully living the life she had always imagined for at least one of her children. He had polished shoes, strategic friendships, a growing hospitality business, and a fiancée named Sloan Mercer, whose family moved through Savannah like they owned half its brick and the other half's future. Sloane was beautiful, composed, and raised in the kind of wealth that teaches people to smile like they've never doubted their place in a room. My mother loved her instantly, not because Sloane was kind, though she usually was, but because Sloane fit the picture. She made Ethan look even more successful by reflection, and that made my mother feel like she had finally produced the life she could show off without explanation. I, meanwhile, remained the daughter, she narrated in soft, tragic language. Clara's doing little housing work now, she would say. She's found something manageable. Or, Clara always cared more than most people. The real world can be hard on hearts like that. People would nod like they understood me, when really all they understood was the version she had packaged for them. Ethan almost never corrected her. That silence became its own kind of betrayal. Not loud enough to defend, not cruel enough to confront directly, just constant enough to tell me exactly where I stood. By the time Ethan and Sloane announced their engagement, Tidemark had grown into something none of them could have imagined. We were no longer sketching ideas in a shed. We were leading coastal resilience projects, negotiating land, building prototypes, advising counties, and preparing for our biggest expansion yet. 3 weeks before Ethan's engagement dinner, the acquisition closed on a riverfront industrial parcel in Savannah that included the restored warehouse venue known as Harbor Foundry. It was going to become our new headquarters and fabrication campus, the place from which we'd scale everything faster and farther. The press package had been prepared. Interviews were scheduled. The public announcement was set for the same weekend as Ethan's celebration, purely by coincidence, the kind of timing that feels made up when you hear it later. I considered telling him beforehand. I really did. Not because I owed him that, but because some small foolish part of me still wanted to believe that given a clean chance, he might act like a brother instead of an audience member in our mother's performance. But then I thought about all the years he had watched me be reduced in public and chosen comfort over courage. So I said nothing. I put on a black dress, helped Grandpa Walter into the car, and drove to Harbor Foundry, knowing I was walking into a room that did not know whose floor it was standing on. The dinner looked exactly like something my mother would love. Warm amber lights, exposed brick, black steel beams, white floral arrangements tall enough to block honest conversation. Savannah's river glittering through the windows. Every table set with the sort of tasteful wealth that is meant to look effortless, even though it took a team of people to make it happen. The Mercer family was there, along with investors, friends, distant relatives, business associates, and the kind of guests who always seem to appear when a family wants to prove it matters. I took my place near the far end of the table beside Grandpa Walter, and I felt that old familiar shift almost immediately, the one that told me my mother had already started working the room before dinner was even served. She touched shoulders, leaned close, laughed softly, collected attention. She was in her element. When she finally stood to give her toast, the room quieted on instinct. First, she praised Sloane's grace, then Ethan's ambition, then the Mercer family's vision and taste and generosity. She made them all sound like a dynasty in the making. And then, because she had never been able to let a room admire one child without dimming the other, her eyes landed on me. She smiled that same sorrowful smile I had seen for years and said, "Clara has always had a big heart. Stability just never seemed to find her." A few people gave strained little laughs. Someone looked down at their plate. My brother stayed silent. My mother tilted her glass and added, "Not everyone is built for pressure. Some people are meant for simpler paths." Grandpa set his fork down hard enough to snap the moment in half. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but before I could say a word, phones began buzzing across the room. One after another. Heads lowered toward glowing screens. Confusion spread across faces. And in the space of a few quiet seconds, the whole evening began to turn. The first person to speak was not my mother, not Ethan, not even anyone from the Mercer family. It was Sloane's father. He was staring at his phone with the same expression people get when the room they thought they understood suddenly opens into another one entirely. Then he slowly turned the screen outward, and even from where I sat, I could see my face. Professional headshot. Navy blazer. Plain background. My name beneath it. Not Clara Bennett, the woman my mother had spent years presenting as unstable and unfinished, but Clara Hayes, founder and CEO of Tidemark Habitat. The headline stretched across the article in bold letters. Tidemark Habitat announces $62 million coastal expansion, acquires Harbor Foundry campus for new headquarters. For a second, nobody moved. It felt like the whole warehouse had emptied of oxygen. Then Uncle Miles stood up so abruptly his chair scraped across the floor, looked from the article to me, and said, with absolute disbelief, "Clara, this is you?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him, then at my mother. She was still standing with her champagne glass in her hand, but all the confidence had drained from her face so fast it was almost shocking to watch. She looked around the room as though she could fix what was happening if she found the right expression quickly enough. But there wasn't one. Not this time. Too many people had the same information at once. Too many eyes had lifted from their screens and turned toward me instead of toward her. Ethan snatched Sloane's phone from the table and read the article like he thought the words might rearrange themselves into something less threatening if he stared hard enough. They didn't. My mother finally found her voice, but it came out thin. "What is this?" she asked, and I remember thinking how strange it was that after years of telling everyone exactly who I was, she was standing in front of proof that she had no idea. "It's the truth," I said. My voice surprised even me. Calm, steady, not triumphant, just done. My mother blinked like the room had betrayed her personally. "You bought this property?" she said. "You own this place?" I glanced up at the steel beams, the old brick, the amber light, then back at her. "My company does," I said, as of 3 weeks ago. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the river against the windows. Around the table, faces shifted through shock, embarrassment, curiosity, and something else I recognized immediately, the uncomfortable realization that they had participated in a lie for years because it had been more convenient than asking questions. Sloane looked at Ethan differently. Uncle Miles looked ashamed. Two of the Mercer guests who had barely acknowledged me earlier now couldn't stop staring. My mother took one step toward me, and I knew that look. It was the same look she always wore when she was preparing to seize control of a story before it got away from her. "Why?" she said, forcing a brittle little laugh. "Why would you keep something like this from your family?" There it was. Not an apology, not confusion about what she had done, just outrage that she had not been included in the version of me that was finally impressive enough to display. Because I had rehearsed that answer in my head for years, it came easily. "You told everyone I left school because I couldn't handle pressure," I said. "You told them I was fragile, lost, unstable. You introduced me like a cautionary tale every chance you got." Her mouth opened, but I kept going. "And when I finally got an opportunity to rebuild something for myself, you made sure that disappeared too." Her eyes flashed then, the way they did when she felt threatened enough to stop pretending. "I never," she started, but I was already reaching for my phone. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me most of all. For years, I had imagined this moment as something explosive, full of raised voices and tears and righteous anger finally let loose. Instead, it felt clinical, precise, like setting down a truth heavy enough that no one in the room could pretend not to see it. I opened the saved voicemail from Marisol Vega and pressed play. Her voice carried across the table in the silence. "Clara, I'm sorry about how this happened. Your mother called again after our conversation." I didn't need to play the rest. The damage was already done. Or maybe the damage had been done years ago, and this was just the first time anyone else had been forced to look at it. My mother went white. Not pale, in the graceful way women in old films go pale. I mean genuinely drained, as if the blood had nowhere left to hide. Ethan lowered the phone in his hand and stared at her. "Mom," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice I had never heard before. Not loyalty, not confidence. Doubt, pure doubt. She looked at him, then at me, then around the room, hunting for an ally. But none of the faces around that table were offering rescue anymore. Grandpa Walter pushed his chair back and stood, slower than he once would have, leaning on his cane. Every eye followed him. "She left graduate school because I broke my body in a storm," he said. His voice was rough, but it cut cleanly through the room. "She moved home. She took care of me. She fought insurance companies, cooked my meals, bathed me, drove me to therapy, and built her business after midnight while the rest of you slept. And all these years, you let her sit at your tables while her own mother explained her like she was a family embarrassment. Nobody breathed. My grandfather turned toward my mother, and I had never loved him more than I did in that moment. She was never the failure in this family, he said. She was the one carrying what the rest of you were too selfish to hold. I wish I could say that what I felt then was victory. It wasn't. It was something quieter and sadder than that. Relief, maybe. Relief so deep it almost felt like grief. Because once the truth is finally said out loud, you don't just gain something. You also lose the last excuse people had for not seeing you clearly. Ethan looked wrecked. Sloane had taken a small step away from him without seeming to realize she'd done it. Uncle Miles rubbed his forehead. One of the Mercer women covered her mouth with her hand. And my mother, for the first time in my life, looked like someone who had run out of performance. She sank into her chair and started crying, but even that didn't move me the way it once would have. I had spent too many years being shaped by her feelings. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't gloating. I was simply finished. I stood up, looked at her, and said the only thing left to say. I did not keep this from my family, I told her. I kept it from you. Then I turned to my grandfather, offered him my arm, and led him out of Harbor Foundry while the room stayed silent behind us. Outside, the river air hit my face sharp and cold, and for the first time in years, the silence around me did not feel like shame. It felt like my life finally belonged to me. Thank you so much for staying with me all the way to the end of this story. If this journey touched you in any way, please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you never miss the next story. Your support truly means a lot. Take care, stay strong, and I'll see you in the next story.